Imagine this. If Hitler had gained the atomic bomb, the world map today would look unrecognizable. Night cloaked Europe in fear. Cities burned. Millions trembled. And deep inside the heart of Nazi-occupied territory, a scientific race was unfolding that threatened humanity itself. German physicists were learning to split the atom, to harness unimaginable power. They believed the Führer deserved a weapon fit for his empire, a weapon of annihilation. A single device could erase a city. A second one could end a nation. Victory would no longer come from armies, but from the terrifying silence of a mushroom cloud. The Allies knew they were running out of time, but the Nazis had a critical weakness. To build a nuclear reactor, they needed heavy water, a rare liquid key to sustaining a chain reaction. And the only industrial plant in the world capable of producing it lay hidden in the frozen mountains of Norway, guarded by soldiers, surrounded by cliffs, believed to be impenetrable. But what the Nazis didn't see coming was a small group of men, scientists, saboteurs, commandos trained by the OSS and the British SOE, men who volunteered for a mission that expected them never to return. Their task: slip into the heart of Hitler's nuclear empire, steal the science he needed most, and destroy the one place holding his atomic dream together. This is the untold story of the spies who stopped a nuclear Nazi world by stealing Hitler's secrets right from under his nose, and it begins long before boots touch the snow, with the war changing and the world praying that someone, somewhere, could stop the bomb before it was born. By 1939, Europe was holding its breath. Nazi Germany had torn up old treaties, rebuilt its army, and marched into territory after territory with terrifying confidence. German tanks rolled over Poland. The Luftwaffe screamed across the skies. Countries that had believed diplomacy would save them suddenly realized they were facing a machine built for total war. But behind the noise of artillery and engines, another kind of race had quietly begun, a race not for land, but for the atom. In December 1938, in a Berlin laboratory, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann made a discovery that would change the direction of history. While bombarding uranium with neutrons, they found that the uranium nucleus did not just split into smaller parts, it released a huge amount of energy in the process. Soon after, physicist Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch explained this result in theoretical terms. They called it nuclear fission. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If a controlled chain reaction could be created, it could produce a new kind of power. If an uncontrolled chain reaction could be unleashed in a compact form, it could produce a bomb unlike anything the world had ever seen. News of this discovery spread quickly through the international physics community. Many of the leading scientists were already in exile from Nazi Germany, having fled persecution and dictatorship. Among them was Albert Einstein. Though he was a pacifist by nature, he understood the danger clearly. If Nazi Germany, with its industrial capacity and militaristic leadership, gained control of atomic weapons, the balance of power would collapse. Einstein co-signed a letter drafted by physicist Leo Szilard to American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter warned that German scientists might be working on atomic bombs and urged the United States to begin research of its own. It was cautious, understated, but the message was clear. This new science could decide the war before it had fully begun. In response, the United States took its first steps into nuclear research. Funding began to flow to university laboratories. Committees were formed, scientists recruited, theories tested. It was the early skeleton of what would later become the Manhattan Project. But at that moment, in the late 1930 seconds and early 1940 seconds, nobody knew who was truly ahead. The Allies were deeply concerned because the original discovery had been made inside Germany. German physicists like Werner Heisenberg, one of the brightest minds of his generation, were still inside the Reich. They were working under a powerful regime that demanded strategic results from science. It was logical to assume that if any nation could push fission toward a weapon first, it might be Nazi Germany. In Berlin, under the umbrella of the so-called Uranium Club, German nuclear research began to organize. It was not one single, perfectly coordinated project, but a loose collection of teams and experiments spread across different locations, competing for resources and attention. Their goal was to understand how to create a sustained nuclear chain reaction. That meant building a reactor, something that could slow down neutrons, maintain a controlled reaction, and generate data for potential weapon designs. To do that, however, they needed more than brilliant equations. They needed materials, uranium, graphite, and something else that would become the key to this story: heavy water. Heavy water is chemically similar to ordinary water, but with a crucial difference. Instead of normal hydrogen atoms, it contains deuterium hydrogen with an extra neutron. This makes heavy water extremely valuable as a moderator in certain types of nuclear reactors. It slows down neutrons efficiently, allowing a chain reaction to be sustained with natural uranium. In the early years of nuclear research, heavy water was very rare. It could not be scooped from a river or lake. It had to be extracted painstakingly, in small amounts, through industrial chemical processes. At the outbreak of the Second World War, there was only one large-scale industrial facility in the entire world capable of producing heavy water in significant quantities. That plant was in Norway. On a remote mountain plateau near the town of Jukan stood the Norsk hydro facility at Vemork. It was built originally to produce fertilizer and hydrogen using hydroelectric power, but one byproduct of those processes was heavy water. During the 1,930 seconds, Norsk Hydro had slowly increased its heavy water output, mostly for scientific purposes. Nobody had yet imagined that this obscure substance would one day be considered a strategic war material. Then Germany occupied Norway in 1940. The invasion was swift and brutal. Norway's government fled. German troops took control of ports, towns, and infrastructure. Among the assets they seized was the Vemork plant. Under German supervision, heavy water production was expanded, guarded, and monitored. Suddenly, what had been a scientific curiosity became a potential key ingredient in Hitler's nuclear ambitions. British intelligence soon grew alarmed. Reports began to filter in through diplomatic channels and scientific contacts that Germany was buying up heavy water, securing supplies, and controlling production at Vemork. Scientists on the Allied side, like Niels Bohr, warned that heavy water was one of the viable paths to a working reactor using natural uranium. If Germany could accumulate enough heavy water, it could give their nuclear research a crucial advantage. The British knew they had to act. But Vemork was no ordinary factory. It was perched on the side of a steep mountainside, overlooking a deep gorge. The only direct access was a single bridge and a cableway. Snow, ice, and altitude made the terrain hazardous. It was protected by guards, searchlights, and the sheer geography of the Norwegian wilderness. Any conventional bombing raid risked missing the target, or worse, destroying the surrounding civilian areas without touching the critical equipment. So London turned to its new covert warfare organization, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Its mission, defined bluntly, was to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, resistance, and secret operations. Vemork, with its heavy water cells and its German guards, became one of SOE's highest priority targets. At this stage, the United States had not yet fully entered the war in Europe, and its own nuclear project was still in its early phases. But intelligence was already being shared among Allied partners. Washington understood that if Britain failed to slow or stop the German nuclear program, the consequences would be global. Even before American boots were firmly planted on European soil, American eyes were watching what happened in Norway. Inside occupied Norway, resentment against German rule was strong. A resistance movement formed, made up of teachers, farmers, workers, students, ordinary people who refused to accept Nazi control. Some of them would later be recruited for specialized sabotage missions. These men knew the mountains, the snow, the patterns of the guards, the flow of the rivers. They knew that reaching Vemork was difficult, but not impossible. From London, planners pored over maps and photographs, trying to answer a single question. How do you strike a heavily guarded, isolated plant, hundreds of kilometers inside enemy-held territory, without an army and without air superiority? The early answers were clumsy and costly. The first serious attempt to neutralize Wehrmacht was launched in late 1942. It involved a combination of Norwegian commandos and British glider-borne troops. The plan, later known as Operation Freshman, was ambitious. Norwegian advance parties would mark landing zones and guide British sappers to the target. They would land by night, destroy the heavy water facilities with explosives, and then escape to Sweden. But the operation was at the mercy of weather, navigation, and fragile technology. On the night of the mission, gliders were towed through stormy skies over Norway. Ice formed on wings, instruments misread. The terrain below was unforgiving mountains, forests, and little margin for error. Both gliders crashed before reaching their destination. Survivors who made it to the ground were captured by German forces. In accordance with Hitler's infamous commando order, many of them were executed. The operation failed completely. Wehrmacht remained intact. Heavy water production continued, and the Nazis now knew, beyond any doubt, that the Allies were interested in the plant. For British planners, the failure of Operation Freshman was a brutal lesson. Sabotaging Wehrmacht would require something far more subtle, far more patient, and far more reliant on local knowledge. Airborne engineer units flown in by glider were too vulnerable, too exposed, and too visible. The answer, they realized, lay in a smaller footprint: handfuls of specially trained Norwegian commandos, inserted quietly, living off the land, guided by resistance contacts, men who could move through the winter wilderness without drawing attention, men who could disappear into the snow. While these early SOE efforts were taking shape, another transformation was unfolding across the Atlantic. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war fully. It was no longer on the sidelines. America would fight in the Pacific, in North Africa, in Europe. But alongside its conventional forces, Washington needed something else: an organization capable of espionage, sabotage, and special operations, something similar to Britain's SOE. That need led to the creation of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Led by William Wild Bill Donovan, a decorated World War I hero and a lawyer by profession, the OSS quickly began to recruit an unusual mix of people: academics, linguists, athletes, radio operators, engineers, escape artists, émigrés, and anyone with skills that could be weaponized in secret war. Some were scientists who understood nuclear physics. Others were outdoorsmen, mountaineers, and skiers. Together, they formed a new kind of force, one that fought with intelligence as much as with bullets. The OSS worked closely with British intelligence. Information flowed back and forth. Joint operations were planned. Among the many threats discussed in secure rooms in London and Washington, one topic kept returning to the table: German progress toward a nuclear reactor and the critical role of heavy water from Norway. Each new report from occupied Europe was weighed carefully. How much heavy water was being produced? How often was it shipped to Germany? Could it be destroyed at the source, intercepted in transit, or rendered useless by contamination? The stakes were enormous. If the Allies underestimated the German program, they risked facing a nuclear-armed enemy. If they overestimated it, they might waste precious resources on a threat that would never fully materialize. But there was one fact nobody could ignore. As long as Wehrmacht continued to operate under German control, Germany had access to heavy water in quantities the Allies could not match. Somewhere, at the intersection of science, resistance, and covert warfare, a decision was forming. A decision that would bring together Norwegian saboteurs, British planners, and American intelligence officers in a single, shared mission. A mission that would depend on secrecy, courage, and the willingness of a few men to vanish into the snow for months with no guarantee of rescue. And that decision would turn the lonely industrial plant at Wehrmacht into one of the most critical targets of the entire war. The failure of the first British operation against Wehrmacht did not lessen the urgency. If anything, it intensified it. Heavy water shipments continued to leave Norway under German guard, transported across icy mountain roads to ports, where they could be loaded onto ships bound for the Reich. Each shipment represented another step forward for Hitler's nuclear goals. After Operation Freshman, British intelligence reassessed every detail of their approach. The terrain around Wehrmacht was studied again. The security arrangements were updated. They consulted the scientists who understood exactly how much heavy water was needed for meaningful reactor progress. The conclusion was consistent. Wehrmacht could not remain untouched, but the new plan would be smaller, quieter, and far more reliant on the courage of Norwegian nationals who knew the land better than any foreign commando ever could. A handful of Norwegians had already been recruited and trained in Britain for clandestine operations. These men were young, many in their 20s, but shaped by personal experience with occupation and resistance. They were skiers, hunters, and outdoorsmen accustomed to the brutal realities of Scandinavian winters. They understood the snow, the wind, and the mountain passes. And they hated the Nazis for what they had done to their country. SOE handpicked several of these men for a mission that would later be known as the most successful sabotage operation of the war. They trained in demolition, radio communication, silent movement, survival, and covert insertion. Every detail mattered: how to prepare explosives in freezing temperatures, how to store food in ice, how to avoid leaving tracks in snow for German patrols to follow. They knew, from the fate of the British glider troops, what failure could mean if captured. Execution without trial, torture before death. Their families possibly put at risk, yet every one of them volunteered. While Norwegian saboteurs underwent training in the Scottish Highlands, Allied intelligence was mapping a broader picture. They learned about the plant's shift patterns, the location of machinery used to produce heavy water, and the layout of the basement-level electrolysis cells where the crucial reaction took place. They also learned something even more important. The German guards believed the terrain itself was the best security. They did not expect a team of saboteurs to come from the mountainside in the dead of winter. For the Allies, that terrain advantage could become the Germans' greatest weakness. By late 1942, a new plan was ready. A small reconnaissance team of Norwegian commandos would be inserted first. They would form a temporary base, scout the area, gather detailed intelligence, and await the arrival of a second team, the demolition unit. Together, they would destroy the plant's ability to produce heavy water. No gliders, no large force, just a handful of men and a single goal. The reconnaissance team, codenamed Grouse, parachuted into the Hardangervidda Plateau in October 1942. The landing zone was far from ideal. High winds scattered the drop. The men spent days locating each other and recovering supplies in the unforgiving wilderness. They built a small shelter and set up radio contact with Britain. Their existence depended on secrecy. They moved only when necessary. They survived by hunting reindeer and keeping an ear tuned to the distant hum of German patrols. Their isolation would last far longer than expected, because at the same time, hundreds of kilometers away, the second phase of the mission, the British glider troops of Operation Freshman, were already doomed. Bad weather and navigation errors led to disaster. Crashes, captures, executions. When news reached the Grouse team via encrypted messages, there was no extraction plan, no relief force, only silence and uncertainty. For weeks that turned into months, the small group endured storms, hunger, and the psychological burden of waiting in hostile territory. Their radio was their only connection to the outside world. They did not know if they would be reinforced or left to die. But they held their ground. They remained committed to the mission, because the threat was too great to abandon. Back in Britain, SOE planners quickly regrouped. Freshman had failed, but the plant still stood, so the mission had to continue. They prepared a new sabotage team, this one composed entirely of Norwegians like the Grouse men, trained in Britain to the highest standards. These new operatives would parachute into Norway, link up with Grouse, and together they would strike Wehrmacht with precision. This second team was codenamed Gunnerside. While the Norwegian saboteurs waited in the mountains, a different kind of intelligence operation was unfolding far away. In the United States, the OSS was ramping up its capabilities. The American scientific community was becoming more deeply involved in the nuclear race. Reports from Europe about German heavy water production fed directly into U.S. strategic calculations. Every intercepted message, Every piece of scientific analysis, every whisper from occupied Europe shaped the urgency of what would become the Manhattan Project. If the Germans gained nuclear advantage first, the consequences were dire. It would not only threaten the military front, it would threaten entire cities, civilian populations, and the balance of the world order. The stakes were nothing less than the future itself. Heavy water was not the only path to a bomb. Germany also had research underway using graphite as a moderator, but intelligence suggested that reactor experiments using graphite were running into problems. Impurities caused reactions to fail. Without a properly functioning reactor, Germany could not produce plutonium, and without plutonium or enriched uranium, there was no realistic path to a bomb. That made heavy water a bottleneck. Destroy it, and you choke the Nazi nuclear program. German oversight at Vemork tightened as the war evolved. More guards, more checkpoints, watchtowers and floodlights dotted the facility. But no matter how secure the plant appeared, the Germans felt confident in one fundamental assumption. The steep gorge on the far side of the plant was an impossible barrier. No team could descend that cliff, cross the icy river below, and climb the other side to reach the plant unseen. The Norwegian saboteurs studied that assumption carefully. By January 1943, signals intelligence confirmed that the gunnerside team was ready. They parachuted into the harsh Norwegian wilderness with skis, weapons, radios, and explosives. The landing was rough. Soft snow swallowed the men and supplies as they hit the ground, but they were alive. They regrouped, and then they set out on a long, grueling trek across frozen terrain to reach the grouse team. It took days. The weather worsened. Food ran short. But at last, in a remote hideaway, the two groups came face to face, frostbitten, exhausted, but determined. They shared stories, updates, and strategy. The mission, once fractured by Freshman's disaster, was whole again. Across Europe, agencies like the OSS were monitoring the effort closely. They knew that the outcome in Norway would affect American planning. If sabotage succeeded, German nuclear research could be set back months or even years. If it failed again, then the world would have to brace for far worse possibilities. What made the sabotage effort particularly urgent was the realization that German interest in Vemork was increasing. Production targets rose. Security grew tighter. The Allies could not afford further delay. The saboteurs prepared to strike. They crafted their approach routes, studied guard routines, observed light patterns through binoculars from distant vantage points. They needed to reach the basement electrolysis chambers, the heart of heavy water production, and destroy the equipment without harming civilians unnecessarily. Precision was essential. This was not a mission designed to spill blood. It was a mission to alter the course of the war. Inside Norway, resistance networks passed messages quietly, sometimes through handwritten notes, sometimes coded into radio transmissions. Every signal carried risk. German counterintelligence units, including the feared Gestapo, were constantly hunting for spies and saboteurs. Radio direction-finding teams roamed the countryside with equipment designed to locate illegal transmitters. One wrong word could mean discovery and death, but despite the danger, the resistance remained strong. Ordinary farmers helped hide supplies. Families offered warmth and bread to strangers who appeared at their door in the dead of night. Skiers delivered coded messages through mountain passes. Norway refused to surrender its dignity. In Berlin, the German nuclear project was facing internal tensions, bureaucratic rivalries, logistical shortages. Some high-ranking officers were skeptical about the timeline for a working bomb, yet others believed the weapon was within reach if support continued. As long as the reactor experiments showed incremental progress, funding and resources flowed. Meanwhile, Allied scientists pushed harder for information. They interrogated captured German researchers. They monitored shipments. They studied physics journals for clues in civilian research. Every sign pointed back to one place, the heavy water production at Vemork. As the final phase of planning unfolded, the saboteurs knew that the outcome of a single night could change whether future battles would be fought with rifles and tanks or whether entire cities would vanish in atomic fire. The night would be cold. The risks, absolute. There would be no second attempt, no reinforcement, no fallback, and as each man tightened his boots, checked his weapon, and concealed his explosives, one truth settled over them. History had placed them between the world and catastrophe. They would go forward anyway. The men chosen for the mission were more than saboteurs. They were symbols of defiance. Their role in this war was measured not in territory taken, but in knowledge denied to the enemy. Each had left family behind. Each had walked away from a life interrupted by occupation. They carried not only weapons and explosives, but the expectations of an entire nation that had refused to bow to the swastika. Some of them had once been students, athletes, mechanics, or clerks. Now they were ghosts in the snow, trained to leave no trace, to blend into the white wilderness, to make the enemy think the mountains themselves fought back. They understood the stakes more personally than any Allied planner in London or Washington. They had seen Nazi boots on their streets, Nazi flags over their buildings, and Nazi commands controlling their daily existence. These men were not driven by medals or promises of glory. They were motivated by something simpler and deeper, the desire to reclaim their country's future. For months, the environment had been their greatest enemy. The Hardangervidda Plateau was one of the most unforgiving landscapes in Europe. Blizzards could sweep across the mountains without warning. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and the wind cut like a blade. There was the constant fear of avalanches, the danger of falling into hidden crevasses, and the knowledge that any sign of struggle, a track in fresh snow, or a wisp of smoke, could bring German patrols running. Even in silence, the saboteurs learned to communicate through nods, eye contact, and instinctual teamwork. Every man understood his role. Every man trusted the others with his life. Their skills were sharpened by necessity, refined by survival. Far above the plant, from vantage points hidden in the rocky ridges, they watched the facility day after day. They saw guards pacing their routines with mechanical repetition. Searchlights swung in familiar arcs. The single access road was patrolled constantly, and the main bridge leading to the plant was heavily watched. If they approached from that direction, they would be seen and killed long before reaching the building. But the gorge below told another story. A narrow river ran through it, crossed by a small railway line. The sides of the gorge were steep, nearly vertical in places, and coated with ice. Climbing down would require courage and skill. Climbing up the other side would require even more. But it was the one place the Germans considered too difficult for human movement, and that assumption would become the key to the mission. As the saboteurs refined their plan, the role of intelligence in the operation became ever more critical. This was espionage intertwined with sabotage. The destruction itself would be physical, achieved through explosives and stealth. But knowing exactly where to strike, which pipes, which cells, which machinery came from careful intelligence work, scientists working with SOE and OSS had studied every detail of heavy water production. They understood the electrolysis process used at Vemork. They identified the vulnerable points, the narrow pipes where heavy water flowed, the cylindrical cells where the reaction occurred. They translated scientific knowledge into tactical strategy. Precision mattered. An explosive charge placed inches from the wrong spot could damage only the surface while leaving production intact. Blowing up the entire plant was not the answer. The Allies needed to ensure the Germans would struggle to rebuild quickly, ideally, that they would abandon the project entirely. The approach to the plant was planned with almost surgical detail. Saboteurs would move under cover of darkness, descend the cliff in silence, cross the frozen river, and climb the opposite side. They would cut through a locked gate without making sound, slip into the basement via a cable tunnel, and reach the electrolysis room deep inside. Once inside, expert hands would attach the explosives timed and shaped to disable the heavy water cells. It was a mission where the differences between success and failure were measured in seconds, centimeters, and whispers. Meanwhile, back in Germany, the Nazi nuclear program was evolving under enormous pressure. Heisenberg and his colleagues debated technical paths, reactor designs, and theoretical obstacles. There were disagreements. Some believed a weapon was within reach. Others were more cautious. But regardless of internal conflict, the program moved forward. Hitler's high command demanded progress. Every scrap of heavy water that reached Germany was treated as a step toward victory. German security services were aware that the Allies understood something of their nuclear ambitions. They simply believed those ambitions were too complex, too technical, and too well guarded to be meaningfully disrupted. For them, the sabotage attempts seemed like desperate measures from desperate enemies. They did not imagine that these same enemies were building a much larger nuclear project of their own, one that would eventually unleash the bomb not in Europe, but on the cities of Japan. Still, the threat of infiltration was real. The Gestapo grew increasingly vigilant in Norway. Local collaborators were encouraged to report suspicious activity, and resistance members were constantly arrested or interrogated. Radio transmissions risked interception every time the saboteurs made contact with London. The web of danger grew tighter each day, but that did not dissuade the men stalking the mountains. If anything, it reminded them that the window for action was closing. The technical angle of the mission highlighted another critical truth. Warfare was changing. This was not a battle where success would be measured by body counts or captured ground. It was a battle of knowledge, engineering, and timing. A handful of men with explosives could alter the trajectory of scientific advancement. They could delay or derail a program that might one day produce weapons capable of annihilating entire populations. It was the first glimpse of a future where information and precision would matter as much as tanks and aircraft, a future where spies could shape history as decisively as soldiers on a front line. Allied command understood that. The OSS understood that. The men in the mountains knew it better than anyone. If Wehrmacht continued to function, the Germans would inch closer to a devastating breakthrough. If Wehrmacht fell silent, the Nazi atomic dream might remain frozen at the theoretical stage. For the saboteurs, the mission also carried a moral weight that was difficult to articulate. They were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to prevent a new kind of war from being unleashed. It was a responsibility no one had asked for, yet one they accepted willingly. They did not fear dying. What they feared was failing. The world they hoped to return to a world without occupation, without secrecy, without the oppressive shadow of the swastika, depended on their success. Their families, their country, and millions of strangers they would never meet were unknowingly counting on them. The climb was coming. The moment when preparation would give way to action was approaching. Each man rehearsed the plan in his mind: where to place his feet, which wires to cut, how to time the detonators. They visualized every corridor, every potential encounter with a guard, every hand signal. No mistakes, no noise, no hesitations. As they sharpened their equipment, a different kind of preparation unfolded across the Atlantic. The OSS was building networks that would later operate deep inside France, Italy, and Germany itself. They studied this Norwegian mission closely. It was a model for the type of operations that would define clandestine warfare. Small teams, deep infiltration, and high-value destruction. Intelligence agencies learned that sabotage against scientific infrastructure could be just as decisive as military victories on the battlefield. The fate of nations could hinge not just on tanks and troops, but on laboratories and factories. The mission at Wehrmacht was proof of that changing reality. If the saboteurs succeeded, they would demonstrate that even the most ambitious technological programs could be stalled by the courage of a few. And if they failed, the consequences would reverberate far beyond Norway. As night approached on the eve of the operation, the men packed their gear in silence. There were no dramatic speeches, no last-minute doubts spoken aloud. Each man carried his own thoughts of home, of comrades lost in previous missions, of the cold wind cutting across their faces. They tightened their boots, tested their climbing ropes, and strapped on the satchel charges that would decide the future of the Nazi nuclear effort. Then they extinguished the fire and disappeared into the darkness. They moved quickly, silently, the snow swallowing their footsteps. The plant lights glowed faintly in the distance, like a beacon of danger against the black mountainside. Above them, the stars were indifferent witnesses. The time had come to descend into the gorge, to take a path the Germans believed no human would dare attempt. Below them flowed the river. Above them, the future of the world waited in uncertainty, and every step forward carried the weight of history. But for all the courage and technical skill the saboteurs carried with them, they were not acting alone in the shadows of occupied Europe. Their operation was the result of a chain of leadership decisions that stretched from frozen Norwegian mountains to high-security offices in London and intelligence war rooms in Washington. At the center of this chain were individuals who understood that the war would not be decided only by generals commanding divisions on open battlefields. The future depended on the ability to disrupt the enemy's plans before they became unstoppable. It required leaders who saw beyond traditional warfare, who recognized that knowledge and sabotage could change the world as profoundly as tanks and artillery. William Wild Bill Donovan, the charismatic head of the OSS, believed that the United States must fight a secret war alongside the visible one. His background had taught him that unpredictable methods could break even the strongest adversary. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill felt the same urgency, pushing his own intelligence services to unleash new forms of warfare against the Axis. Together, these leaders supported missions that many military officers considered too risky, too unconventional, or too small to matter. But these small missions were aimed at critical arteries. The heart of German nuclear hopes beat through Wehrmacht, destroy the plant's ability to produce heavy water, and that heart would weaken, delay reactor progress by months or years, and the bomb might never leave the blueprint stage. Meanwhile, German counterintelligence units were becoming increasingly aggressive. They understood that British sabotage groups had failed once and were determined not to be embarrassed again. More guards had been placed at Wehrmacht. Patrols increased around the approaches to the plant. The Gestapo demanded vigilance, and German commanders obeyed. The slightest hint of resistance activity, and locals risked interrogation or execution. Yet even with increased security, the Germans could not escape a fundamental weakness built into their defences. They had designed protection for the obvious routes, roads, bridges, and tunnels. Their focus was on preventing a frontal assault. They did not believe that their enemies would crawl along a frozen cliff, risking death with every footstep, in order to reach the plant from a direction that nature itself defended. That blind spot would prove fatal. Beyond the tactical considerations, there was also a deeper moral dimension unfolding behind the scenes. Allied leaders and scientists were forced to confront unsettling questions. What did it mean to prevent the enemy from building a weapon that you yourself were racing to create? If sabotage succeeded, and Germany's nuclear ambitions were crippled, would the Allies become the sole possessors of a technology capable of mass destruction? Scientists in Britain and America wrestled with the ethical weight of their work. They understood that they were unlocking forces far greater than conventional explosives. They feared what would happen if those forces fell into hands guided by hatred and authoritarian rule. The saboteurs climbing into the darkness did not need theoretical discussions to motivate them. They had lived under those hands. They had felt the value of freedom being stripped from everyday life. Across the ocean, physicists like Enrico Fermi, Szilard, and Oppenheimer were pushing deeper into atomic research under tight secrecy. They knew very well that the race was tight. They desperately needed every advantage time most of all. If the saboteurs could delay the German program, the Manhattan Project could advance without the nightmare of German breakthroughs nipping at its heels. The stakes were clear. If Hitler got the bomb first, he would use it without hesitation. The concept of deterrence did not exist in the mind of the Nazi leadership. If they possessed a weapon of such immense power, they would deploy it to force surrender and reshape humanity according to their ideology. Every scientist who understood nuclear physics knew what that would mean. The images that filled their minds were not of tactical victories, but of cities turned into firestorms, of entire populations erased before they even understood what had happened. The moral responsibility of preventing that future rested partly in the hands of the men scaling ice-covered rock walls under starlight, and on the other side of the conflict, Nazi intelligence analysts were working to predict Allied sabotage targets. They reviewed lists of strategic facilities, oil refineries, aircraft factories, chemical plants, communications hubs. Wehrmacht was certainly valuable, but the Germans believed that its remote location and heavy defences rendered it safe from meaningful attack. They overestimated the power of concrete and steel. They underestimated the power of will. German commanders prepared for direct assaults, but the saboteurs moved like smoke, untrackable, elusive, unstoppable once they committed to their path. Even within German scientific circles, doubt lingered. Some physicists were unsure whether a bomb could be built in time to influence the war's outcome. But doubt did not slow production orders. Doubt did not stop heavy water shipments. As long as there was a chance of success, the Nazi leadership demanded progress. The Allies could not gamble on German skepticism. If Wehrmacht remained operational, the possibility, however uncertain, of a Nazi atom bomb stayed alive. As the saboteurs advanced toward their target, a psychological tension extended all the way to Allied command centers. Every radio update from Norway carried the weight of nations. Analysts studied intercepted German communications, hoping to find signs that security had relaxed or routines had grown predictable. Any shift could provide the saboteurs an opportunity or could expose the entire operation to disaster. Diplomats working with the Norwegian government in exile held their own breath. They knew that the successful destruction of heavy water facilities would send a powerful message. Occupied Norway was not defeated. It still fought in the shadows. Its sons were striking blows that would echo around the world. The psychology of resistance mattered just as much as the technical objective. If the German nuclear program could be delayed, Allied scientists would gain precious months. If Norwegian morale could be strengthened, the occupation would become harder to maintain. If German leadership could be shown that their most secret projects were vulnerable, paranoia would spread through their ranks. Sabotage was as much a weapon of the mind as of machinery. The saboteurs now stood in a position where their success held three simultaneous outcomes: military delay, scientific advantage, and moral triumph. But the balance was fragile. One misstep on the descent into the gorge, one glint of light reflecting off metal, one guard turning at the wrong moment, and the mission would collapse into violence and loss. They would be killed on the spot or hunted down in the mountains. The impact of Operation Freshman had already shown what happened to captured special operators under Hitler's commando order. Failure would not simply mean loss of life. It would mean the German nuclear program continued unhindered. It would mean that the future might belong to those who believed in conquest through fear. As the operation approached its most dangerous phase, the saboteurs carried with them the heavy knowledge that success would be nearly invisible to the world. Few would ever know their names or the scale of what they had prevented. There would be no parade, no public announcement, no medals handed out while the war still raged. Their reward would be a chance to keep fighting if they survived the night. In the darkness, the only sounds were the crunch of boots pressing into snow and the distant hum of machinery from the plant. The path ahead was a razor's edge between triumph and tragedy. The men quickened their pace, adrenaline replacing fatigue, focus eliminating fear. They had studied every turn, every shadow, every unpredictable element the mountain could throw at them. Now, action would test whether all of that preparation was enough. Below them, the lights of Wehrmacht glowed coldly, reflecting off steel towers and concrete walls. The heart of Hitler's nuclear hope beat just ahead, and the saboteurs would reach it silently, dangerously, determinedly. This was the night that would decide the future of the atomic age. The gorge awaited, a dark mouth in the earth. The river crept below like a frozen serpent, and the cable lines stretched toward the plant like arteries feeding a dangerous machine. The next step would take them beyond planning. The next step would commit them fully to the sabotage. The next step would change everything. The descent began in absolute silence. The men lowered themselves along the icy cliffside with ropes that felt far too thin for the weight they carried, not the weight of their gear, but the weight of what failure would mean. Frost clung to every surface. Darkness concealed the depth beneath them. Their breath formed soft clouds that vanished instantly into the night. One slip, one snapped rope, and a man would fall into the gorge below, disappearing forever into the freezing river. But step by step, guided by instinct, training, and a kind of stubborn courage that cannot be taught, they continued downward. Their gloved hands gripped cold rock. Their eyes searched for footholds in the dim light reflected from the plant above. The roar of the river grew louder. The plant seemed to watch over them, glowing faintly under German control like a fortress of industry. This factory was the enemy more dangerous than any tank or gun, because inside its walls, science was being twisted into a weapon meant to dominate the future. At the bottom of the gorge, The saboteurs crossed the river quietly. The water was a black ribbon beneath them, deadly if they fell. They used the railway track that ran along the canyon wall, moving cautiously, every sound swallowed by the cold air. Then came the climb. The opposite side was far steeper. Ice sheets glistened on rock that offered no kindness. The men climbed with slow precision, picking their way upward like mountaineers on a forbidden ascent. Their world shrank to the next handhold, the next breath, the next quiet heartbeat. Above them were guards, rifles, and searchlights. But the greatest danger remained nature itself. One sudden gust of wind, one misjudged angle, and everything would end. Hours passed in tense progression. Finally, the saboteurs reached the plateau near the plant's perimeter. The building loomed closer, now a concrete beast tethered to the mountainside. Faint voices of German guards drifted across the air. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. Snow crunched under the boots of patrols, moving along predictable paths. The saboteurs flattened against the shadows, invisible shapes beneath the walls. They waited. Timing was the axis on which their mission spun. A guard turned. Another paused to light a cigarette, a flicker of flame briefly brightening the scene. The commandos moved when attention diverted, freezing whenever a guard's gaze returned. A gate blocked the way. Cutting it would make noise, so they examined the lock, chose their tools carefully, and worked with the delicacy of surgeons. Metal scraped softly. The lock gave way. But not with a snap, it surrendered slowly, quietly. The men slipped through. Inside the fence, a door awaited them locked, but vulnerable. One saboteur knelt beside it, withdrawing a pair of improvised tools honed for this exact purpose. Seconds passed long, fragile seconds filled with the fear that a handle might turn on the other side. Then the lock clicked, and the door opened into darkness. They entered the factory grounds, concrete corridors, pipes snaking across ceilings, and the distant hum of machines driving the electrolysis process that separated heavy water from regular water. Above them, German soldiers patrolled, unaware that the most dangerous men in Europe were beneath their feet. The saboteurs followed their memory of reconnaissance sketches. They descended stairs leading into the lowest level of the plant, heart of the operation. There, behind locked doors, sat the electrolysis chambers, rows of cylindrical tanks filled with the substance that Hitler desperately needed. Heavy water, shimmering with scientific possibility, the potential future of nuclear terror. The door to this room was the last barrier. Beyond it, success or death. The commander of the team reached for the handle, only to find that it was locked. They could have blasted it, but the explosion would alert every guard in the building. They needed silence. One saboteur slipped a thin tool into the lock and applied gentle pressure. A tiny metallic sound echoed down the corridor, too loud, it seemed. Every man froze, breath held, ears straining for any reaction from above. Nothing. A final twist of the wrist, the lock gave way. The door swung open. They entered the room. Pipes and valves lined the walls. The air was warmer here, machinery breathing heat into the confined space. The heavy water cells stood like silent metal giants, unaware that their purpose was about to end. Each saboteur knew exactly where to go. They divided swiftly, their movements precise. Explosive charges were placed against the most critical components, the electrolysis chambers and connecting equipment. The charges were small, shaped for focused destruction rather than spectacle. The goal was to cripple production thoroughly, not blow the plant apart. As they worked, something unexpected happened. A light flicked on upstairs. A guard, perhaps finishing a round or checking a meter, walked closer. The creak of footsteps echoed. Every saboteur froze, hands still on the explosives, bodies pressed against machinery. The guard paused, perhaps only listening to the distant machinery, perhaps trying to place a sound he thought he heard. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the footsteps moved away. The saboteurs resumed their work. Detonators were set. Timing synchronized. The fuses would give them just enough minutes to escape into the night, but only if everything went perfectly. There would be no second chance. The team leader checked every charge personally. Satisfied, he gave a silent signal, thumbs up, a small gesture but one that carried enormous weight. Every man slowly backed toward the exit. The last saboteur slipped through the door and shut it gently behind him, sealing the fate of Hitler's heavy water inside. Then, with controlled urgency, they moved through the corridors, retraced their route toward the perimeter fence, and prepared to disappear into the snow once more. Time was running. They cleared the fence. They navigated the frozen cliffside pathway. The world around them seemed to pulse faster, each second counted. And then the explosions erupted, a muffled thud, then another, and another. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The dark sky above them glowed faintly, as the heart of heavy water production was shattered. Inside the plant, alarms screamed, guards yelled. Panic surged through the building as soldiers rushed to locate the source of destruction. But by then, the saboteurs were gone, swallowed by the night from which they came. Below them, the gorge lay silent once more. Above them, the plant burned with confusion. The saboteurs skied away at a speed that matched their rush of adrenaline, racing towards safety, knowing that every meter of distance put between them and the plant was a meter away from German retaliation. Behind them, chaos reigned. The Nazis were stunned. The machinery that took years to build had been destroyed in minutes by a handful of men with homemade explosives. The saboteurs did not celebrate. They only pushed forward, knowing German troops would soon spread across the region in search of vengeance. Their mission was complete, but the danger had only begun. Chaos erupted inside Wehrmacht as soon as the explosions subsided. Alarms echoed through concrete corridors, guards scrambled with weapons raised, and engineers rushed to the lower floors only to find twisted metal and flooded chambers. The heart of heavy water production, the electrolysis cells, was devastated. Pipes were cracked open like broken bones. Months of effort, machinery worth fortunes, and Germany's nuclear aspirations lay mangled in steam and darkness. The German officers demanded answers. How had saboteurs infiltrated the most secure industrial facility in Norway? How had they escaped without detection? And why had no guards seen anything? Angry accusations flew back and forth, while the truth crept through every room of the facility. The plant had been penetrated from the one direction the Germans considered impossible. The mountainside had swallowed the intruders and now protected them in their escape. But the saboteurs understood their job wasn't finished when the charges detonated. They had to survive long enough to ensure news of their success reached London. German troops would soon spread like wildfire across the plateau, combing every cabin, every trail, every hint of movement. The team split into smaller units to reduce the risk of capture. One group headed toward the Hardangervidda plateau, prepared to survive a winter that could kill as efficiently as any patrol. They would rely on skis, discipline, and local support. The other group pushed toward Sweden, a neutral safe haven, where they could eventually return to Britain. Behind them, German blood was boiling. Orders went out to catch the saboteurs at any cost. Patrols searched forests and mountains. Aircraft surveyed snowfields for tracks. Propaganda spread through occupied towns, offering rewards for information. But no matter how fierce the hunt became, the saboteurs moved with the silence of wind over ice. The mountains protected their own. The initial success was stunning. British and Norwegian intelligence received encrypted confirmation that the core of heavy water production had been destroyed. London understood instantly what this meant. The timeline for a Nazi atomic bomb had just been violently pushed back. But the Germans were not ready to surrender their ambitions. Even as they assessed the damage, they began repair plans. Engineers worked day and night to replace broken equipment. Heavy water production resumed slowly at first, but progressing. Meanwhile, the Allies tried another approach. British bombers flew missions over Norway, targeting Wehrmacht from the sky. But the narrow valley was difficult to hit accurately, and explosions often missed the critical machinery. One bombing raid killed Norwegian civilians in the nearby town of Jukan, a tragic reminder of the cost of war. Though the damage hindered operations, it did not stop them entirely. Germany was determined to keep the plant alive, and so the race continued. By early 1944, German intelligence received orders. What heavy water remained in Norway would be shipped to Germany for final reactor experiments. If the plant could not operate securely, the material would be moved closer to the core of the Reich, where progress could speed up again. This decision provided the Allies with one final opportunity to strike. They had delayed the program, now they needed to cripple it completely. The heavy water destined for Germany would travel from Wehrmacht to Jukan, down mountain roads to the lake port at Mal. Then it would be loaded onto the ferry SF Hydro to cross Lake Tinzio, a deep, icy body of water carved by ancient glaciers. On the opposite shoreline, a railway would carry the cargo to the coast, and from there, to Germany. The Allies learned this plan through secret channels and resistance networks. The Norwegian saboteurs, some of the same men who had destroyed the electrolysis cells, were once again called into action. They knew the terrain, they knew what was at stake, and they knew that if the heavy water reached Germany, the sabotage at Wehrmacht would be reduced to a setback rather than a decisive blow. This time, the risk was even greater. The target would not be isolated in a mountain gorge. It would be a passenger ferry filled with civilians. The saboteurs faced a brutal dilemma. Sink the ferry and destroy the heavy water, but innocent Norwegian lives would be lost. Yet allowing the shipment to pass unchallenged risked catastrophic consequences for the entire world. They studied schedules, manifests, and passenger lists with care. They discovered the best opportunity: a Sunday departure with fewer civilians aboard than on weekdays. Even so, the men understood that no option came without tragedy. But the larger tragedy, a Nazi regime holding the power to vaporize cities, would be far worse. They prepared explosive charges with timers calibrated precisely. The bomb would detonate at the deepest point of the lake, ensuring that the heavy water cylinders would be lost forever in an underwater grave where recovery was impossible. On the early morning of the 20th of February 1944, under cover of darkness, the saboteurs slipped into the ferry mooring area. They moved quickly and quietly beneath the wooden planks of the dock. The SF Hydro rested in still water, unaware that history was being attached to its hull. With practiced hands, the saboteurs placed the charge near the keel and set the timer. Every second spent in that confined space increased the risk that a guard might stroll by, a worker might investigate a noise, or a passenger might awaken early and wander the deck. But their timing held steady. The bomb was set. The men vanished into the night once again. Hours later, unaware of the danger beneath their feet, the ferry's crew prepared for departure. Passengers boarded workers, farmers, families. Some carried small bags of food or hand-knitted garments. Others brought radios or paperwork. None knew that under their boots, the fate of the Nazi nuclear program was about to sink into the abyss. The ferry departed at 10:45 a.m. The lake was calm. Snow dusted the mountains. It might have seemed like any other winter morning under occupation. Children spoke quietly. Men smoked cigarettes on the deck. A few German soldiers stood near the cargo area, guarding large crates that held the precious heavy water. As SF Hydro reached the deepest part of Lake Tinzio, the timer reached 0. The explosion tore through steel. The deck heaved upward. Water flooded the hull instantly. Panic consumed the air shouts, screams, splintering wood. The ferry tilted violently as icy water swallowed it whole. Passengers were thrown into the freezing lake, grasping for floating debris. Some survived long enough for rescue boats to reach them. Others disappeared beneath the surface forever. Their final moments spent fighting for breath in water cold enough to kill within minutes. The heavy water, sealed within its steel cylinders, sank like stones. Down into a darkness even the Germans could not dare to penetrate. When word reached Berlin, disbelief turned to fury. The sabotage was too coordinated, too precise. It was clear. Allied intelligence was deeply embedded in their plans. Trust within Nazi scientific circles eroded. Accusations of betrayal surfaced. Morale plummeted. More importantly, their nuclear program ground toward a halt. With Wehrmacht's production crippled, with the stockpile lost to the lake's depths, and with Allied pressure increasing on every front, the German atomic project failed to produce a reactor capable of creating weapons-grade material. Experiments continued in scattered labs, but the race was already lost. Hitler would never hold the bomb. The saboteurs who vanished into snow and shadow had changed the course of history. They denied the Nazis the one weapon that could have rewritten the outcome of the war. But they did so at a cost. They would carry silently for the rest of their lives the knowledge that innocent Norwegians died that February morning. The burden of necessity is a heavy one, and not all victories feel like triumphs. Yet without their actions, the world might have seen cities destroyed not by conventional firestorms, but by nuclear blast waves. The Allied invasion of Europe might have faced a Germany capable of annihilating entire beaches. The war might have ended under the shadow of a Nazi bomb. These saboteurs, unknown to most, uncelebrated in their time, ensured that future never came to pass. And though their mission remained classified for years, its consequences reached into every corner of the modern world. The atomic age would be shaped by American and Allied hands, not by the horrors of a Nazi victory. When the surviving passengers of the sunken ferry were pulled from the freezing waters, they clung to life with chattering teeth and shaking hands. Some German soldiers survived. Some Norwegian civilians did not. In the aftermath of the sinking, grief spread across local communities. Mothers, fathers, and children waited for relatives who would never return home. The saboteurs, safe but carrying the weight of those sacrifices, pushed deeper into hiding. They knew their mission had not been clean. It had been necessary, but necessary choices do not leave the heart untouched. While German forces investigated the wreck and interrogated survivors, the truth remained hidden. They suspected sabotage, of course they did, but they could not prove how or by whom. Resistance networks stayed invisible, protected by coded silence and the harsh wilderness of Norway. The damage from the combined operations now became clear to the world of intelligence. Reports reached London and Washington through encrypted channels. Heavy water stockpiles destroyed, production impossible to resume at scale, shipments lost forever. The Nazi pursuit of a nuclear reactor had been violently reset. For Allied scientists, the news was a lifeline. It meant the Manhattan Project could proceed under reduced pressure, no longer forced to constantly look over its shoulder for fear of Germany reaching the finish line first. American laboratories accelerated progress in uranium enrichment and plutonium production. Every day of delay inflicted on Germany had been a day gained for the Allies, and Germany knew it. Hitler's confidence in a superweapon future faded. He had once spoken with grand certainty that German science would deliver the tools needed to reshape the world. Now, those assurances cracked beneath the pressure of Allied success. Inside the uranium club, frustration and disillusionment grew. Heisenberg and his peers continued their experiments, but without adequate heavy water or industrial support, their reactor remained incomplete, a steel cylinder filled with uranium cubes that could not reach criticality. The dream of the Nazi bomb had slipped away, sinking into the same cold depths as the ferry's cargo. Meanwhile, the OSS grew stronger. The success of the operations in Norway became a blueprint for future missions. American intelligence officers studied every aspect: the planning, the local coordination, the scientific targeting, and adopted these methods in operations yet to come. Espionage and sabotage evolved from desperate tactics into foundational strategies. The story of the Wehrmacht sabotage also rippled through occupied Europe. Resistance movements found hope in the news that a handful of determined men had struck a blow against Germany's most secret ambitions. Sabotage campaigns increased in frequency and boldness. Rail lines exploded. Factories halted. Communication networks fell into disarray as people across the continent took inspiration from Norway's invisible warriors. The psychological impact was enormous. The myth of Nazi invincibility had cracked. Norway's national spirit, crushed by occupation, stood a little taller. However, the world did not yet know the full truth. The details of the heavy water sabotage were classified, buried within files held by British intelligence and OSS archives. The saboteurs returned to quiet lives or continued resistance work, unrecognized by the civilians who passed them on snowy streets. They were heroes in silence. Their victory was not celebrated publicly, but its effects echoed around the world. The atomic bomb would still be built, but it would be built by those who sought to end tyranny, not enforce it. The war was far from over. Yet in the race for the most devastating weapon ever conceived, the Allies had gained control of the clock, and time, once running against them, was now firmly on their side. As the years wore on and Allied armies pushed closer to Germany's heart, The truth about the Nazi atomic effort slowly surfaced. Documents were captured, scientists were interrogated, laboratories, once guarded like holy monuments of the Reich, stood empty and silent under foreign control. Allied intelligence confirmed what had long been suspected. Germany had never come close to building a bomb. They had theories, they had talent, but they lacked the critical materials, infrastructure, and unity of purpose required to make the leap from concept to weapon. What they no longer lacked after Norway was time. By mid-1944, both British and American leadership understood that the sabotage of Wehrmacht had not just delayed the project, it had crippled it. The Nazi dream of nuclear dominance had drowned in Lake Tinzhou alongside the heavy water cylinders. The men who made that possible lived through the remainder of the war, mostly unseen. Some continued their work with the resistance, guiding Allied units as they advanced north. Others lay low, knowing German eyes were still searching for them. Not all survived to see liberation, but for those who did, freedom came with little celebration. No medals awaited them immediately. No crowds cheered their names. Their mission had been classified a story not yet ready for public knowledge. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world confronted revelations so vast and horrific: concentration camps, scorched cities, shattered nations, that the quiet sabotage of a remote plant in Norway seemed too small to demand attention. Yet those who understood the truth knew better. If the saboteurs had failed, the war could have escalated into something beyond imagination. The Normandy landings might have been met by atomic fire. London or Moscow could have been chosen as targets for a demonstration of German supremacy. Negotiations might have taken place beneath the blackmail of annihilation. Hitler was not a man who believed in restraint. Instead, his atomic ambitions perished in the snow. In the years after peace returned to Europe, the former saboteurs attempted to reclaim ordinary lives. Some returned to school, some built families, some chose careers far away from the shadow of war, and some carried invisible wounds that only silence could treat. Recognition came slowly, decades later, when classified documents were opened and historians pieced together the story. Honours were eventually awarded. Streets and monuments in Norway now bear the names of men who once drifted like ghosts through the mountains. Their legacy lives not in the destruction they caused, but in the destruction they prevented. The geopolitical landscape of the post-war era was shaped in part by their success. The United States emerged as the world's first nuclear power. The Soviet Union soon followed. A new balance, a dangerous balance, defined global politics for the next half-century. The Cold War brought near misses, tense negotiations, and a doctrine of mutual assured destruction. Humanity had entered an age where miscalculation could erase civilizations. But even in that precarious world, one nightmare had been avoided: a Nazi regime wielding atomic power. The OSS, shaped by such clandestine operations, evolved into the Central Intelligence Agency, influencing international affairs for generations. Covert operations became a permanent tool of national power. Scientific intelligence became central to military planning, and the concept that a small team of operatives could alter the fate of nations became a foundational truth of modern warfare. The men of Norway's sabotage missions did not consider themselves architects of history. They believed they were simply doing what had to be done to defend their homeland. Yet what they achieved extended far beyond their borders. They stole victory away from tyranny. They denied a monster the weapon he desired most. And they quietly shifted the trajectory of the 20th century. Only later would the world learn how close it came to another kind of darkness, one defined not by tanks and artillery, but by the cold, blinding flash of atomic light. History often celebrates the battles we can see: the tank assaults, the beach landings, the cities liberated street by street. But sometimes, the greatest turning points are decided far from the front lines. Sometimes, the course of the future hinges on quiet footsteps in the snow, on whispered plans in a hidden shelter, on the courage of men who expect no recognition. The sabotage of Nazi Germany's heavy water program was one of those moments. The world that emerged after 1945 was shaped by bold decisions and dangerous gambles made not only in war rooms, but in the shadows. In those shadows knelt a handful of men in winter gear, attaching explosive charges to metal cylinders deep beneath a Norwegian factory. They were not famous. They were not powerful. Yet they carried the fate of millions on their backs. The men who crossed the gorge and slipped into Vemork did so knowing they were unlikely to survive. They accepted a mission that appeared impossible because they could envision something worse than death. A world where freedom was extinguished under a nuclear-armed dictatorship. They stopped that nightmare before it could draw breath. They denied one of history's most dangerous regimes the chance to wield ultimate power. They turned scientific progress into a shield rather than a sword for tyranny. Their actions allowed the Allies to gain control of the nuclear timeline, and that, more than anything, shaped the decades to follow. The atomic bomb was eventually born into a world already exhausted by war. Its detonation in Japan ended one conflict and began a new era defined by caution and fear. But it was not Hitler who held that weapon, not the men who built concentration camps and set fire to Europe. It was held instead by those who, at that moment in history, possessed restraint, an imperfect restraint, but restraint nonetheless. The Cold War would prove that restraint is fragile. Yet the absence of a Nazi atomic bomb stands as one of the most important near misses in human history, and that absence can be traced to a lonely mountainside in Norway. It is tempting to view such missions as inevitable successes when told in hindsight, but the truth is far more precarious. One slip on the cliff, one guard turning left instead of right, one spark of bad luck in the dark. Had even a single detail gone wrong, our world might look very different today. The saboteurs themselves understood that. They moved forward not because they were fearless, but because they believed fear was worth facing if it meant protecting the future. Their victory did not come with roaring applause. For decades, their story remained locked in classified archives, known only to those who understood the stakes. When recognition finally arrived, many of the heroes were already old men, some unable to speak any longer of what they had done or endured. And yet, the silence around their mission is fitting in its own way. They struck invisibly. They saved silently. And the world continued without realizing how close it had come to a different ending. Today, we live in a world still shaped by nuclear tension, a sobering reminder that science can be both salvation and threat. But we also live in a world where the darkest path was blocked before it opened. Not by armies, not by nations, but by individuals who refused to surrender their courage. The heavy water sabotage stands as proof that sometimes the smallest groups of people can prevent the largest catastrophes. It reminds us that the future can turn on the narrowest edge of human decision. A single mission, a single night, a few quiet figures against the dark. The men who sabotaged Vemork may have disappeared back into the snowy wilderness, but their impact did not vanish with their footprints. It lives in the peace that followed. It lives in the cities that still stand. It lives in the billions of lives that were never lost. History often forgets the names of those who operate in the shadows. But every time we imagine a different world, a darker one, ruled by fear and crushed by atomic tyranny, we see the outline of the heroes who prevented it. They were ghosts in the snow, and because of them, the world kept breathing.